Hi there. Today I want to talk about the intuitions behind why we divide the sample variance by n-1 and not n. Here I've defined a dataset X with n observations. The sample mean, x bar, and the sample variance, s squared, are defined as written down here. Before we get into the whole conversation of why n-1, I want to talk about a concept called degrees of freedom. And I'll denote this as DOF. So what exactly does DOF mean? Well, mathematically speaking, the degrees of freedom is the number of independent variables needed to express all properties of a system. But what exactly does this mean? For the purpose of this example, I'll talk about the simplest example, the X and Y space. If I have a system that can be described by the X and Y space, this means that it is 2 degrees of freedom. Why? Because it needs the X and the Y part to describe it in its 2 parts, so 2 degrees of freedom. But suppose now I draw a line, y equals mx plus c. In this case, suppose I have a value x1. Then the value of y is fixed because I have a constraint y equals mx plus c. So I don't need to know the y values, I just need to know the x values. So this means that I can describe the whole space with a constraint just with one dimension, my x-axis or the y-axis. So in this case, there is 2 minus 1 equals 1 degrees of freedom. So we note that the constraint reduces the number of degrees of freedom. Okay, for completeness, in statistics, the degrees of freedom is the number of parameters that may vary independently. Okay, now that we know this, let's talk about why we divide by n-1. First things first, my x bar. To know x bar, I need to know x1 up till xn, so it is n degrees of freedom. And we notice that we divide by n as well, so this means the degrees of freedom corresponds to the number we divide by. That's really interesting. Now let's look at the sample variance. The first thing to note is that to calculate the sample variance, we need to know the value of x bar. So we need to know x bar. And now, suppose we know the value of x1, x2 up till xn-1. Then I want you to see that we don't need to know the value of xn because xn is just xn is just nx bar minus x1 minus up till xn-1. So this is really cool because instead of describing the sample variance with n observations, all I need is n-1 observations because I already know x bar acts as a constraint. So instead of n degrees of freedom, this is now n-1 degrees of freedom. And thus, that's why intuitively we divide by n-1. Of course, there is a more rigorous way to prove why we divide by n-1, and it's because that the sample variance will give us an unbiased estimate of the population variance, but this is just to give some intuitions about the whole thing.